Hello, everybody, and happy almost Halloween. It's not quite Halloween yet, but it is right around the corner, just a couple days away. And to get into that Halloween spirit, today we're going to be writing scary stories. So let's go through our agenda for this activity. We're going to start with the learning target, and then we're going to have short reviews of setting, character, problem, dialogue, and sensory words, because these are all important for your scary story writing. And then we'll look at the story cards that you'll be using, plus an example so you know how to use them when you write your story. And then it'll be your turn to write. So the learning target for this activity is I will be able to write a scary story including information from story cards that I chose. Now, this story will be an imaginative story. It's not going to be based on any real occurrences, unless there have been some crazy magical real occurrences in your life that we don't know about. But let's move on to our first little short review of setting. Now, think to yourself, what is setting? I'll give you a couple seconds to think. Setting is when and where the story takes place. So let's look at this example and try to find the setting in it. It was a cold night in the old castle. Luckily, the king had his pet cat, Theodore, to keep him warm. What is the setting of this story? It would be the old castle. Next, what is character? Or what are characters? Because there's usually more than one in a story. Characters are the people, animals, or creatures that appear in the story. So let's go back to this example and try to find the characters. It was a cold night in the old castle. Luckily, the king had his pet cat, Theodore, to keep him warm. So the characters in this story would be the king and his pet cat, because that's a person and an animal that appears in the story. Now we'll talk about problems. And we all know what a problem is in our lives, but what is a problem when it comes to a story? Think about that for a second. A problem is a situation in the story that the character or characters need to solve. This can also be called the conflict. You may have heard it called conflict before. So let's continue with this example. Now we're at the next section of it and try to find the problem. So the king and Theodore were shocked when a gust of wind blew out all the candles in the hall. "Oh no!" shrieked the king. "What are we going to do now?" "Meow," Theodore replied. So what is the problem that the king and Theodore are facing? It's a gust of wind blew out all the candles in the hall. Now let's talk about dialogue. What is dialogue? Well, it's a talk between two or more characters in a story. And a way to find dialogue in a book is they're always marked with quotation marks. That shows that a character is speaking. And it's also important to think, how did that character say the dialogue? How are they speaking? Did they cry? Did they yell? Did they just say it? Did they whisper it? Scream it? It's important to pay attention to which word you're choosing when you're writing dialogue, because there is a huge difference between whispering something and yelling something. So let's visit the example again and find the dialogue. So, the king and Theodore were shocked when a gust of wind blew out all the candles in the hall. "Oh no!" the king shrieked. "What are we going to do now?" "Meow," Theodore replied. What is the dialogue? This should be pretty easy because they're always marked with quotation marks. So the dialogue in this example is, "Oh no!" The king shrieked, not said or whispered. The king shrieked it. "What are we going to do now?" And then Theodore replied by just saying, "Meow." Now, the last thing I want to talk about is sensory words. And sensory words are words that add more detail to writing by describing how something affects your senses. And I provided a little chart here with just a few sensory words that you could use in your writing or to give you an idea of what they are. And these are really important because they can add so much more detail, and we're going to see here in a second when we go back to the example. But think of words that appeal to how you hear something, how something tastes, what it looks like, how it feels, or how it smells. Now we're going to visit the example again, both sections, but we're going to add some more sensory words in to really see how they affect the example and how they add so much more detail. So it was a cold, wet night in the old castle. Luckily, the king had his fluffy pet cat, Theodore, to keep him warm. The king and Theodore were shocked when a chilly gust of wind blew out all the candles in the hall. "Oh no!" the king shrieked. "What are we going to do now?" "Meow," Theodore replied. So now, with just adding 3 more words, they're the words in orange, by the way, we know so much more about this story. Not only was it a cold night, but it was also wet. And everyone knows that when it's cold outside, adding rain or dew in the morning just makes it seem like it's 10 times more cold than it actually is. We also know that Theodore is a fluffy cat, which is good because when I was first writing this example, I was picturing Theodore as a sleek little small cat that didn't have much fur. But now we understand why Theodore can keep the king warm. It's because he's so fluffy. And then the last word that we added was chilly. And that's important to add because we know it's a cold night. So the wind that comes through isn't going to be hot wind. It's going to be chilly, which is a synonym to cold. Now we're going to talk about the story cards. So when you're writing, you're going to choose your story cards, which we'll get to in a second. And the story cards will be 1 problem card, 1 setting card, 2 character cards, and 2 item cards. Now the ones you see on the screen right now don't have to be the cards that you choose. I just showed you an example of what they are. And you're going to be tasked with implementing these into your story, every single one. I'll show you how I did it with this story example called The Mad Scientist Creation. On Halloween night at the mad scientist's lab, the scientist heard a strange noise. Coming from the other side of the lab, he heard a quiet gurgle. The scientist grabbed his flashlight and followed a set of thick footprints he found on the floor. Then he stumbled upon a grimy, gooey monster. Shocked by what he was seeing, the scientist didn't realize the monster was his own creation. The monster came closer and embraced the scientist in a warm, sticky hug. "I'm so happy I created you," said the scientist. So you see here, all the underlined portions are the story cards that I chose. And it shows how just you picking 6 cards, you can create a nice, scary Halloween story out of them. And that's exactly what you're going to be doing right now. So as you see here, these are all of the problem cards, and you're going to choose 1. So I'll sit here for about 5 seconds, but it's a video, so if you need to pause to have more time, you can pause. Go ahead and choose your problem card now, just 1. And write it down somewhere so you don't forget and have to keep coming back to this section of the video. Now you're going to choose 1 setting card. Make sure to write it down in your notebook or on the piece of paper you're using. Now you're going to choose 2 character cards. For the problem and the setting, we only chose 1, but your story is going to have 2 characters. So choose the 2 that you think you could write a good story about. And lastly, you're going to choose 2 item cards. Now there's a lot here, just like for the characters, so you may need to pause for a little longer to make sure you really choose the 2 that you want. And for the item cards, They don't have to be a big part of the story. If you remember in mine, the scientist just picked up his flashlight and followed the footprints. That's it. They weren't a main aspect like the two characters were. Now that you have all of your story cards, it is time to write your story. Remember, include all of your story cards. What I like to do when I'm writing these is I have them written down in my journal so I don't forget them. And whenever I put them in my story, I mark it off. That way I know I've used it. Also, don't forget to use sensory words to be more descriptive. And try to add some dialogue. It doesn't have to be a full conversation. If you remember from my mad scientist story, there was just one line where the scientist said he was happy he made the monster. And lastly, be creative and have fun. There's so many different problems, setting, character, and item cards that everybody's story should be completely different. I'm really excited to see what y'all are going to come up with. And remember, if you need to go back to any section of the video, you can. The sensory word list will be there. The different characters. You should have your different story cards now, but if for some reason you need to go back, it's a video, so you'll be able to. Thank you for watching. Enjoy writing and have a great Halloween.